On May 18th, 1891, the wind came over the Kansas grass with a dry hiss that sounded like grain pouring into a bin, and Prairie Rose stood beneath a pale sky at 78 degrees, bright enough to make fresh pine boards shine on Main Street. The settlement had been chartered only 9 years and counted 312 souls between the Depot Road and the Church Rise, with false front businesses set broad to impress rail buyers and homestead wagons alike. Men spoke of expansion, of another grain elevator, of brick to replace timber when money came in from autumn contracts. Women bartered lamp oil and flour in the shade of awnings already warped by spring heat. Children ran messages along plank walks where mud had not yet hardened. It looked at first glance like a town becoming permanent. Roy Harmon knew better than to trust appearances. He lived at the north edge in a one-room lean-to, 12 feet by 16, roofed in tar paper and patched tin, where his freight wages of $1.20 a day covered beans, coffee, harness repair, and little else. His hands were broad and rope-scarred from loading grain sacks and stove crates at the siding. His coat, once black, had gone the color of soot and dust. He kept ledgers in a biscuit tin beneath his bunk, every coin entered by date and purpose because no banker in Prairie Rose would lend to a widower without acreage worth boasting of. When the shift bell rang before dawn, he was already at the depot. When the shift bell ended at dusk, he measured distance, slope, soil, and wind as he walked home. 6 years earlier, outside Salina, a spring cyclone had struck at supper and torn his frame house apart at the sill line. The storm took his wife, Eliza, and his young son, Thomas, in a single night that left fences folded flat and wagons lodged in cottonwoods a quarter-mile away. Roy survived beneath a cast-iron stoveplate and broken joists until neighbors cut him free after sunrise. No elder had prepared him for that ruin. No family method had been passed from one generation to the next. His schooling came afterward, from failure severe enough to strip away vanity, from counting which sections of roof had lifted first, from learning that nail patterns and pride did not hold against rotational force when foundations were shallow and wall plates were light. By the winter of 1887, he had started riding freight routes on rest days into outlying claims where sod settlers built low and thick, not for appearance but endurance. He paid 10 cents to copy notes from county agricultural bulletins in Junction City and Topeka. He studied courthouse records listing storm paths, dates, and casualty counts. He asked practical questions of practical men and women who had no use for speeches. How deep to set corner posts, how wide to overlap cut sod, how to bind rafters down into earth mass so uplift had to lift ground itself before it lifted roof. He learned that a wall made of earth was not elegant but patient, and patience saved lives. Prairie Rose had little patience for Roy Harmon. Its dominant builder was Silas Pemberton, 41 years old, broad through the chest, always in a clean vest, even at work sites. His beard trimmed with the precision of a banker and his boots polished despite dust streets. Prosperity sat on him like tailored cloth. He held contracts on nearly every porch and church wall in town, extended credit to council families, and measured success in visible height. Taller facades, steeper roofs, wider windows, more imported lumber. He called timber progress and soil poverty. Men who wanted civic standing hired Silas. Men who challenged him found orders delayed, supplies redirected, and reputations thinned in public conversation. When Roy bought a low parcel southwest of the Livery, half an acre others dismissed as worthless because spring water pooled there after heavy rain, Silas watched from the general store platform and laughed in a voice pitched for listeners by the feed barrels. "Harmon is digging himself the tomb," he said. If fear could be mortared, he would build a courthouse. The phrase moved through town by supper. The tomb. Store clerks repeated it when Roy came for salt and lamp wick. Teamsters grinned and asked whether he planned to bury himself now or wait for winter. Women at the pump lowered their voices when he approached and resumed when he passed. No one struck him. No one barred his path. Prairie Rose practiced a colder form of contempt, the kind that made a man visible only as a cautionary tale. He did not answer with speeches. He marked grade stakes and kept working. Late June brought a morning that many called pleasant, warm at sunrise with a soft haze lying low over the grass. By 7 o'clock, the north wind hardened and veered east within an hour. By 8, the town sat beneath a metallic stillness that made wagon tongues creak louder than usual. Roy saw swallows cutting low across lots as if pressed down by weight above them. He saw cattle bunch shoulder to shoulder along fence lines despite open pasture. He felt pressure drop fast enough to ache behind his eyes, the same pressure he remembered from Selena, where air had seemed to tighten before it broke. That afternoon, he opened his biscuit tin, counted his savings to the cent, and spent $87.40 in one sweep, $22 for cottonwood beams cut true at 14 feet, $11.60 for wagon load lime, $9 for iron strap and fasteners, $14.50 for 30 screw augers, and the rest for split poles, rawhide lengths, clay hauling, and team hire. He could not replace with his own back. The merchant at the counter who had called him the Tomb 2 days earlier wrote the figures with raised brows and asked if he intended to start a fort. Roy answered in 12 words, "I intend to build what wind does not carry away." He began by setting a half-buried central room into the shallow rise he had graded by hand, cutting sod in blocks 14 inches by 18, 4 inches thick, and laying them in staggered courses like masonry, grass side down, joints broken every row to prevent shear lines. He tamped each lift with a hardwood maul until edges knit and moisture sealed them. The base walls rose to 8 feet thick, then tapered to 6 at parapet height, not by guesswork, but by string line, and plumb weight checked every third course. He placed cottonwood beams across the span and cinched them with iron straps sunk into embedded posts, then packed the roof with sod over split poles and clay in layers designed to absorb strike, shed debris, and resist uplift by mass rather than elegance. Silas came twice each week on pretense of inspecting nearby work and stood with customers at the road to deliver commentary. "A sane man buys lumber," he announced one evening while Roy and a hired hand rolled another wagon of cut sod. "A fearful man buys dirt and calls it salvation. Look there, friends. Harmon Folly is rising one clump at a time." The nickname replaced the first. Children repeated it as they walked past with school slates. Teamsters used it as a landmark for directions. Silas repeated, often and publicly, that panic could lower land prices more surely than weather, and that talk of violent storms frightened investors who might otherwise settle. He treated Roy not as a neighbor making choices, but as a public nuisance threatening prosperity. Roy measured thickness and slope while the remarks passed over him. One evening, when a freight clerk asked why he did not answer insult with insult, he tightened a strap buckle and said, "Let them talk. Words do not hold a roof in place." By the first week of July, the outline stood clear against the prairie, low and blunt, and unlike every structure in town, its walls rough with root ends, its doorway set narrow to reduce wind entry, its profile so plain that even mockery carried unease beneath it. In daylight, it looked ungainly beside painted storefronts. In stormlight, it looked deliberate. Roy slept in his lean-to still, then rose before shift to wet, cut, stack, and tamp until depot hours claimed him, and returned after dark to do the same by lantern flame. Every layer he finished represented labor converted into margin, another inch between flesh and flying timber, another calculation made in earth instead of hope. That same night, after the depot lamps went dark and the town dogs settled, Roy climbed down into the half-cut chamber with a shovel, an iron bar, and a lantern wrapped in wire, then began striking the clay shelf beneath his own floor plan, because the room he had built for weather above ground would not be enough if wind arrived with debris and collapse. He measured depth by a marked hickory pole and worked in lifts of 8 inches so the walls would not slough in one face, throwing spoil into a rope sling and dragging it up plank runners he had greased with tallow to save his shoulders for the next load. The cellar floor reached 5 feet below grade by dawn, and he climbed out caked in red earth, walked to freight shift without breakfast, and loaded barrel stoves until evening with split knuckles and eyes stung from lantern smoke. By the second week of July, the pit stood 12 feet deep at its lowest corner, squared to 12 by 22 feet, with a narrower throat cut east for a secondary passage that would bend twice before daylight, so a single blowdown could not seal every soul inside. He lined the first 4 feet in dry stone gathered from creek beds, 10 miles out, fitting each piece by weight and face instead of mortar, so pressure would settle and lock rather than crack. Prairie Rose watched and judged in the manner of settlements that still feared scarcity more than shame. Silas Pemberton did not descend to crude insults each day. He used the steadier tools of rank. At the council table, he argued that Roy's digging invited panic, that any talk of public refuge diminished confidence among incoming buyers, and that confidence was the only currency a young town possessed in abundance. At the mercantile counter, he instructed the clerk to deny bulk nails on credit, then remarked within easy hearing that men who expected the world to end should pay cash. When Roy asked 3 carpenters whether they would cut and set heavy lintels for day wages, each offered the same answer with different eyes. They had promised their labor elsewhere, and they did not wish to lose winter contracts. Silas stood that week in a new broadcloth coat from Wichita, silver watch chain bright against his vest, and spoke with the composure of a man whose buildings had never yet met a direct strike. Roy made new plans from old facts. He cut oak pegs at night, boring pilot holes with a spoon bit and shaving each pin to swell tight when damp. He traded 2 days of loading pay and 1 spare harness buckle to Elias Boone, a retired blacksmith with 1 weak knee, for a run of hand-forged brackets bent from wagon tire iron. He split rawhide thongs in lengths of 6 feet, soaked them, twisted them, then laid them over pared cottonwood members so they would harden as they dried and clamped the timbers into one resisting piece. He set his main lintel with 2 layers of beamstock, each 14 inches deep, separated by plank spacers and bound by iron strap every 20 inches. Weight above would press them together. Wind would have to break both. In late July, he began storing what he could not grow or mill himself. 2 barrels held hard red wheat sealed with waxed cloth and ash. 1 barrel held dried beans sorted against stones and weevils under lantern light after shift. He hung salt pork from cross poles in the coolest corner, each slab wrapped in muslin and pine smoke, then packed sorghum and coarse salt in lidded crocks, sunk halfway into tamped earth to steady temperature. A rain catchment trench fed a settling cistern he had lined in clay and lime wash, then piped by gravity into casks inside the lower room. When full, those casks held near 1,200 gallons, enough for careful ration and washing discipline if streets vanished and pumps filled with wreckage. He entered each measure in his ledger, 60 souls for 4 days at strict allotment, not comfort, with 1 ladle per turn and boiled water only. The mockery changed shape as the structure changed purpose. Children now stopped at the ditch edge and chanted Harmon Folly and sing-song rhythm before running off when Roy lifted his head. Teamsters took to wagering whether the mound would melt in autumn rain. A seamstress told another at the pump that fear had made Roy forget how to live among neighbors. Yet wagoners coming off the southern track began asking practical questions when no audience crowded near. How many could fit below if wagons overturned near the depot? Which path avoided the schoolhouse corner where carts bottlenecked at market hour? Whether a horse could be tied at the outer trench without blocking the gate? Roy answered each question with distance, angle, and number, never with sermon. On August 29th, just past noon, a narrow funnel west of Flint River tore two barns apart and carried roofing half a mile into wheat stubble. The report came by riders at dusk, one horse lathered to the belly and one man bleeding from the brow where a board had glanced off him. Prairie Rose gathered under awnings to listen, shook heads, said bad luck, and resumed hammering the same light frames in the same method by morning. Silas declared at the store porch that one local funnel did not justify living underground like a burrowing animal, then sold out his remaining sash glass by noon to families replacing front windows cracked by hail from that same weather line. Roy rode out at first light the following day, measured the barn footings left in place and the span lengths that had failed first, then came home and widened his main chamber by 2 feet on the north wall, where crowd pressure in entry would likely set hardest during a sudden run from Main Street. Before dawn the next morning he rode Cedar, his bay gelding, to the school rise, and looked at the new bell tower braced only for weight and ringing, not lateral torque. Its timbers were tall, proud, and under-fastened where they met the roof frame, a civic emblem built for certainty in fair weather. He turned in the saddle and traced likely collapse lines toward Main Street, where wagons narrowed between porch posts and storefront hitch rails. 3 days later, he cut his planned sleeping alcove from the design entirely. That choice was visible in lumber and chalk. He pulled up the narrow cot platform he had framed for himself and relaid the space as stepped benching, 3 levels deep, with the highest tier against the far wall for elders who could not stand long and mothers holding infants above floor draft. He marked lane lines in white chalk at 1-foot intervals from doorway to rear bend, so arrivals could move in rows and be counted without crush. He widened the outer door to 36 inches clear, then added a second inner door set offset by 5 feet, so if one panel jammed under pressure, the other still opened into shelter. He fashioned a hand-crank vent stack from stovepipe and baffled elbows, capping the top with slatted guard boards angled downwind, and tested draw with lamp smoke until the flame burned steady with all doors shut. On the 4th of September, he nailed a plain cottonwood board beside the gate and painted words in lamp black, thick enough to read through dust. Storm shelter, enter without asking. Silas laughed when he saw it. He stood with 2 merchants and tapped the sign with his cane, as though it were a theatrical poster. "You see what comes of indulgence," he said. "A private fear now dressed as public duty. If weather ruled settlement, none of us would have left the river towns." Roy drove 2 nails into the lower hinge plate and rose slowly, face streaked with clay. "If weather did not rule settlement," he said, "there would be no graves on the prairie." Silas held his gaze, then gave a short nod that did not concede and did not dismiss. That evening after sunset, he sent a laborer from his hotel yard with a tape line and instructions to pace the doorway, count bench length, and report whether a grown man could pass in a crowd without turning sideways. The laborer did as told, wrote numbers on scrap paper, and returned by lantern light. Silas read the figures alone at his office desk and folded them into his vest pocket before morning. By the 2nd week of September, signs accumulated that Roy did not ignore. Swallows flew low and restless before noon, then vanished altogether near dusk. Ant hills along the south road rose with fresh skirts of packed grit, as if built in haste. 2 strings of geese crossed earlier than usual, high and hard east despite heat still lingering at 84 by afternoon. Roy checked barometer scratch marks on his wallboard and found pressure dropping in uneven steps over 3 days, Not smooth, not seasonal. The kind of descent that made old injuries ache. He spent that night running rope lines from the shelter gate to 3 fixed points that would remain if sheaths lifted. The stone trough behind Boone's smithy, the buried axle post near the depot ditch, and the east fence corner of the church lot where ground lay slightly higher. He knotted loops every 6 feet so hands could find purchase in dust or dark. He cut spare lengths and coiled them in a dry crate by the door. He stacked lanterns, flint, tallow rags, and 2 pry bars beside the inner bench. He placed his ledger and a carpenter pencil at the entry shelf, because order would matter if panic came first. At dawn, he checked each knot again. Prairie Rose woke on September 14th, 1891 to still heat that reached 92 by late afternoon and a light so bright it flattened distance. And by 4:30 the western horizon carried a dark shelf cloud, rising in layers like iron laid upon iron while thunder moved beneath it without rain. Roy stood at his gate, felt the wind drop out entirely, and watched dust along Main Street settle straight down as if pressed by an unseen hand. Then hail struck the first roof in hard white bursts, and every horse in earshot began to pull at its tie. Then Roy moved, because preparation had always been motion measured ahead of panic. He swung the outer gate wide and dropped the crossbar into its iron cradle so it could not slam shut in a gust, set 2 lanterns on opposite shelves to keep shadows from blinding arrivals, and cranked the vent handle 20 turns until the baffle stack began to draw. Hail rang on the sod roof in a hard, fast drum, but the chamber below held a steady cool near 56 degrees, unchanged by the heat outside. He checked the chalk lanes with one sweep of his hand, reset the ledger on the entry plank, and tied Cedar's lead to the first rope line at the gate. The bay gelding planted its hooves and lowered its head against the windless pressure that came before violent air. Main Street did not answer as one body. It split along habit and pride. Several storekeepers shouted for shutters and cellar doors. Others called it only a hail squall and dragged rugs from window fronts to save goods from glass. At the hotel porch, Silas Pemberton stood in shirt sleeves with his coat over one arm and ordered his men to bring families inside the dining room, saying thick beams and proper carpentry would outlast any prairie tantrum. 3 boys ran past him toward Roy's parcel and were called back by their uncle, who seized one by the collar and pointed toward the church basement. The bell in the school tower began to ring in short, uneven pulls, not for service but warning, and each strike came flatter as wind shifted around the belfry. Roy began the work that he had rehearsed in solitude for months and never announced as heroics. He clipped a coil of 1/2-inch manila line to his belt, looped spare rope over Cedar's saddle horn, and rode the first route to Boone's smithy, where 2 wagon teams had already tangled traces in fright. He cut one strap free, passed the lead rope into a woman's hands, and gave instructions that were all number and direction. Follow knots, 1 hand each loop. Keep left at the second stake. Do not run when you reach the gate. She nodded once and moved. 4 children in tow, the youngest carried high against hailstones that struck like thrown gravel. Roy turned back at once, because one guided group meant little if the street remained full. Within 7 minutes, the western light changed from bright gray to green-black, and that color settled under every awning like bruised copper. The warning signs were no longer subtle to trained eyes. Dust that had lain flat now lifted in narrow spirals at ground level and raced east, while cloud mass above moved northeast, crossed currents that marked organized rotation. Rain curtains formed south of town and were cut apart before reaching the first houses. A low inflow wind began to pull hats, paper, and loose boards toward the southwest, toward the dark base where no rain was falling. Roy saw swifts vanish from the eaves and chickens press under wagons with wings spread low. Then he heard the deepening tone that storm veterans described with different words and recognized in the same instant. Not thunder, not wheels, but sustained force gathering. The shelter filled by counted increments, exactly as the chalk lines had been set to manage. Nora Bell, the schoolteacher, arrived first from the school rise with 11 pupils, skirts and jackets soaked through from hail melt, face cut by flying grit, yet voice still firm enough to keep the children in pairs. Roy marked 12 on the ledger and sent them to the rear bench tier. Elias Boone came second with his daughter Lena and 2 apprentices from the forge, carrying a crate of bandage cloth and 1 kettle. Mateo Quinn limped in with 3 ranch hands and asked where to tie horses without blocking the trench. Roy pointed to the stone trough line and moved him on. Each group entered, turned left and sat by row. No crushing at the throat, no shouting at the door. The system held because he had built it for bodies under stress, not for graceful weather. By 5:15, as hail gave way to heavy drops that struck slantwise from the southeast, Mockery still rode the edges of fear. A grain broker from the depot stopped at the gate, looked down at the packed benches and hanging pork, and muttered that Harmon Folly smelled like a badger den before stepping inside with both sons behind him. One seamstress who had laughed at the pump all summer refused entry for nearly a minute, insisting she would wait for her husband at home because decent families did not burrow in dirt. The next gust threw a shutter across the lane and split it on the ditch stones, and she crossed the threshold without another word. Roy made no answer to either. He kept count, directed feet, and sent older boys to the lower tier with water dippers and strict instruction. Half ladle only until full tally was known. Silas held his ground longer than most, and his authority delayed others. From the hotel steps he called to travelers and boarders that the second-floor hall had stronger framing than any sod mound, and that panic would kill faster than wind. 2 of his carpenters echoed him, waving families under the porch roof. Yet when the first full gust front arrived, it struck from 3 angles in less than 30 seconds, lifting dust and rain in crossing sheets that made the street disappear between one blink and the next. The hotel signboard tore free, hit a hitch rail and spun into the feedlot. A section of porch fascia peeled back and exposed joist tails that had never been strapped to the wall plate. Silas saw the nails flex in green timber and looked toward Roy's gate. He did not call out. He sent a laborer running with 12 boarders, then stayed to gather the last group himself. Roy's project continued to grow even as the storm advanced because he had never treated completion as a single day. Between rescue runs, he widened the outer trench where runoff began pooling, cutting a quick channel with his shovel to keep water from backing into the entry throat. He drove 2 additional stakes at the church line rope and tied them with a low catenary curve so smaller children could hold at chest height. He laid wet quilts over the inner door seam to blunt dust infiltration, checked the vent crank again, and adjusted the baffle angle 1 notch leeward when inflow reversed. He shifted 2 barrels from north wall to center post to increase thermal mass around the infirm bench where the doctor would work if injuries came. Even then, under a darkening sky, he kept making the place more useful to others than to himself. At the gate, with rain needling sideways and the rope line bowing under hand after hand, he kept repeating the same warning facts over the wind: pressure drop, crosswind shear, animal flight, clear route before dusk when clouds stacked from the southwest. Households that had dismissed him now came silent, knuckles white on knots 6 feet apart, following his marks exactly. One councilman, hatless and mud-splashed, shouted that official warning had come too late, and then went quiet when Roy pointed him left toward open bench space. Another man muttered that panic would ruin trade before any storm could. The old merchant logic stripped down to fear as boards started lifting off nearby sheds. Roy answered him the way he had answered all season, voice flat and practical. Confidence did not anchor rafters. No one laughed at the line now. They bent, moved, and entered. Now, with the sky lowered into a single rotating wall, those same households came by rope line in silence, heads bent, one hand gripping knots exactly 6 feet apart as he had set them. The warning signs sharpened to unmistakable geometry. A clear slot opened beneath the cloud base where a range should have been, and in that slot a tapered column dipped, withdrew, then descended again thicker than before. Cottonwood leaves along the ditch turned their pale undersides all at once. The church, weather vane, spun free and vanished. From the west, lots came the staccato crack of boards failing not from decay, but from uplift. Roy sent Cedar with a stable boy to the rear cut bank and ordered the horse loosed if fencing went down, because tethered animals became anchors for flying timber, and he would not risk trapped lives at the gate. By 5:20, 90 souls had been counted inside the chamber and lower cellar, with chalk rows nearly full and one lane kept clear for late arrivals. Roy assigned Lena Boone to ledger updates, Elias to lantern trimming, and Nora Bell to keeping the children seated with names called in a steady loop, so fear did not spread by rumor. He placed Mateo Quinn and 2 ranch hands at the inner door braces, each man with shoulder set against crossbars if suction hit the passage. Outside, the town's sounds broke apart into separate violences. Glass, metal, livestock, shouted names lost in wind. The school bell gave one last strike and stopped. Silas arrived with rain streaming off his sleeves, hat gone, face stripped of the confidence that had carried him through every council vote since charter year. Behind him stumbled his sister-in-law and 2 hotel guests, one with a bleeding scalp wrapped in table linen. Roy took them in with the same hand signals he had used for every family, no faster and no slower, then marked 4 more on the ledger and pointed them to the center bench. Silas paused at the threshold long enough to look back toward Main Street, where the upper half of his hotel had begun to sway in movements no frame wall should make. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then shut it and took his place against the inner stone. The final warning came not as sight but force. Air rushed toward the southwest in one sustained pull that flattened grass, dragged loose planks uphill, and made every lantern flame bend horizontal despite closed doors. Roy dropped the last bar into place, wrapped his left hand through the rope fixed to the center post, and gave the chamber one command in a voice that carried through earth and fear alike. Heads down. Hold to wood. Do not break line. Then the full weight of the tornado reached Prairie Rose, and the 8-foot walls took the first blow. The impact came as a single shove that seemed to lift the ground and strike it back down. Earth shuddered through the floor timbers. The vent stack screamed once as debris skimmed across the cap, then settled into a hard, pulsing draw. Above them, hail and timber fragments hammered the sod roof in bursts that merged into one continuous roar, and the chamber darkened when dust forced itself through the outer passage, despite quilts and double doors. Roy held the center rope and counted under his breath, not from fear but from habit, because timing told him whether they were under the core circulation or the outer flank. At 5:23, the first violent rotation crossed the west lots. By 5:25, the pressure drop deepened so sharply that 2 children cried out and clapped hands over their ears. Elias Boone shouted for everyone to swallow and breathe through cloth. Nora Bell moved bench to bench with the ledger names, voice steady, calling each child and receiving each answer in turn. The walls did not flex. The walls listened and held. Outside, Prairie Rose came apart by layers. The false fronts on Main Street failed first. Broad, decorative facades peeled from roof lines and carried east like cards stripped from a deck. The depot windows had already shattered under hail, and now the freight platform roof lifted whole from its corner posts, turned once in the air, and vanished behind the grain wagons. The church lost shingles in a bright spinning sheet. Then the north wall gave way where mortar had never fully cured after summer heat. The new school bell tower swayed, paused, and folded into the school roof exactly along the unbraced joint Roy had measured, driving beams through classrooms that had been full less than an hour earlier. Silas Pemberton's hotel endured long enough to betray every confidence he had sold. The first story remained upright while the second-floor joists began to roll under suction, each member twisting free where nails had been used without strap ties. At 5:27, the entire front facade detached from the frame and dropped into the street in one broad collapse that erased the porch where he had stood issuing orders. The signboard that had read Pemberton House struck the hitching rail and snapped in the middle, the painted name broken into two boards that skidded through mud and hail. Inside the chamber, people heard none of that in full detail, only the mixed percussion of their town being dismantled. Mateo Quinn and the ranch hands leaned into the inner braces while each gust tried the doors from a new angle. Water began to seep under the outer threshold when runoff overwhelmed the trench, and Roy shifted two boys with buckets to keep the channel clear by hand. Lanterns dimmed in grit-choked air. Lena Boone trimmed wicks and relit one with flint when a downdraft smothered it. Silas sat on the center bench, shoulders bent, one hand on his sister-in-law's sleeve, and watched Roy work the vent crank each time suction changed. No one spoke his old nickname in that room. At 5:31, the core strike moved northeast beyond the church rise, and for 40 seconds the noise dropped from full violence to heavy rain and tumbling debris. Several men started up from the benches. Roy cut them off with one command: "Stay down. Rear wind is coming." He had seen secondary surges kill those who mistook a lull for safety, and he kept everyone seated until the next blast hit from the opposite quarter at 5:32, sharp and shorter but fierce enough to crack the outer gate hinge and drive a branch through the first passage wall. Children screamed. The branch stopped at packed sod. The chamber held again. By 5:42, the roar thinned to broken gusts and distant crashes. By 5:51, thunder moved east of town and rain settled into a steady cold sheet. Roy waited through 3 full minutes of lesser wind before lifting the inner bar. He took Elias, Mateo, and one ranch hand to clear the passage because the outer door had jammed under mud, shattered plank, and a section of wagon tongue. Together they pried, shoveled, and dragged until a narrow opening appeared. Air smelling of wet lime, splintered pine, and overturned earth poured in. Prairie Rose at 6:05 was scarcely recognizable as the same settlement that had stood in bright heat before supper. The temperature had dropped from 92 to 63 in less than 2 hours. Rain streamed through open wall frames where houses had stood enclosed. One entire row of storefront awnings lay wrapped around fence posts, half a block away. The church bell rested in the road, cracked cleanly through the lip. The hotel was a waist-high pile of joists and plaster with one stair section standing alone like a stripped rib. Livestock wandered dazed between debris fields, reins trailing, flanks streaked with mud. Then the suffering began in earnest, because survival in the first blow was only the first accounting. Roy set a triage line just inside the shelter gate where the ground remained firm, ordered lanterns hung under the eave, and sent able hands by pairs with rope and pry bars to call names through wreckage. He made assignments by capacity, not status. Silas was sent with Elias to the hotel pile. The councilman who had mocked panic was sent to dig at the church wall breach. Lena Boone boiled water in kettles over a protected trench fire, fed from dry split wood Roy had stacked under oilcloth weeks earlier. Rain kept trying to kill that fire. She kept relighting it. Nora Bell was missing. Her pupils were all accounted for except 2 sisters, Ada and Ruth Miller, who had run home when the first hail began. After Roy opened the shelter and switched from lockdown to organized search, Nora joined a rope team heading toward the school corner when word came that the Miller house might have taken a direct hit. She was struck during rescue operations in unstable debris near the school entry. By dusk, Roy and Elias recovered her from that site, with both girls brought in alive and entered to triage. The sisters were later recorded with injuries, but expected to recover. Nora Bell did not survive. Mateo Quinn survived the chamber and went back out at once to secure loose teams that were trampling through wreckage and tangling in wire. He tied 3 horses to the stone trough behind Boone's smithy, exactly where Roy had anchored a rope line that morning, then crossed toward the depot to cut a 4th animal loose from a broken trace. A flying plank struck him at the edge of the freight lot. Men reached him within a minute and carried him to the infirm bench, but the injury to his chest and breath was beyond what bandages and boiled water could mend. He died just before midnight with rain still tapping the sod roof, one hand gripping Roy's sleeve until the last breath went out of him. Near dawn, when the storm had fully passed and the temperature fell to 49, the medical ledger was updated after triage. Clara Boone, an infant, did not survive storm-related complications, despite sustained treatment efforts through the night. 3 deaths, each named aloud into the ledger beside the survivors, changed the sound of the shelter from panic to grief. No one in Prairie Rose could pretend by morning that the event had been exaggerated talk. 87 structures had suffered major damage or total failure within the settlement boundary. Of the town's 12 largest frame buildings, 9 had lost roofs and 5 had collapsed beyond repair. Roy's sod refuge stood with gouges, 1 cracked hinge, and a scarred outer wall where debris had struck, but the chambers remained dry enough to sleep and strong enough to hold another blow if one came. Contrast became fact, not argument. Help came to Roy now from those who had denied he would ever be needed, and the asking was plain. At first, it was a stranger from a freight wagon camp east of town, a man with a broken wrist wrapped in shirt cloth, who had heard there was one place with clean water. He arrived at 7:10 on September the 15th, with 2 women and an older brother carrying a fevered child. Roy opened the ration ledger, measured their allotment, and gave them space on the lower bench without asking payment. By 8, families from the south lots lined the trench for boiled water and dry beans. By 9, Silas Pemberton stood at the gate, mud to his knees, coat torn at one shoulder, and asked in a voice stripped of public authority whether Roy would help recover bodies from the hotel ruin before heat and rain made identification harder. Roy handed him a pry bar and 3 lengths of rope. "We work in teams of 4, he said. "No one climbs unstable frames. We clear from the top down and mark each find on slate." There was no speech about old insults. There was no pause designed to make a lesson. He stepped into the rain beside Silas and started at the north side, where joists had pancaked over the dining room. Through that day and the next, help was sought and given in widening circles. A boy from the church lot begged for boards to make splints. Roy sent him to Elias, and then carried 2 braces himself. A ranch wife asked whether she could draw extra water for washing her husband's wounds. Roy approved it and cut his own portion to keep the barrel count balanced. 2 merchants whose stock had been ruined asked for dry corner space to salvage ledgers and deed books. Roy gave them a shelf and told them paper would matter when rebuilding began. He also told them to haul latrine trenches farther downhill before dusk. They obeyed. By the evening of September the 16th, 48 hours after impact, the shelter had become not merely a refuge, but the operational center of a town that had lost its center. Roy posted work rotations by lantern light, assigning night watch, debris clearing, meal boiling, burial preparation, and child tending by name and hour. He marked each assignment in the same careful hand that had once tracked pennies in a biscuit tin. Silas reported for every shift he was given and took none of the easier tasks. When he asked where to start at dawn, Roy pointed to the church wall and said, "Anchor points first. Grief can wait 1 hour. Wind will not." And so they went to work beneath a sky finely clear, with the smell of wet earth and fresh-cut timber rising over Prairie Rose, and with one hard truth fixed in every mind. What had been mocked as fear had become the only structure in town that could turn terror into shelter. That truth governed the next hour, and then the next, until work itself became the only language Prairie Rose trusted. Roy moved through the shelter yard with a slate in one hand and a carpenter pencil in the other, issuing rations and tasks by measured need, not by family name or old allegiance. Each adult received boiled water by quart mark, each child by half, beans and wheat by weighed scoop, salt pork only after the infirm and nursing mothers were served. He opened the lower stores he had sealed in July, recorded every barrel draw in the ledger, and showed 3 volunteers how to reseal lids with waxed cloth and ash so spoilage would not steal what wind had spared. By the morning of September the 17th, 71 souls were eating from provisions once mocked as hoarding, and men who had spent hundreds of dollars on painted lumber stood in line beside laborers whose homes had been sod from the beginning. He taught while he fed. He showed how trench latrines must run downhill from water lines by at least 40 paces, how wet debris had to be sorted at once into burnable, salvageable, and dangerous piles, how temporary wall banking with earth and wagon canvas could cut nighttime heat loss by half even in broken houses. At midday, he set a demonstration by the ruined church wall, driving iron strap over a cottonwood brace and sinking the anchor into tamped fill, while 6 onlookers repeated each step. The cost of that brace was $1.80 in reused timber and strap. The church roof that had failed above it had cost nearly $600 in new pine, trim, and tower joinery. The comparison required no speech. 3 days after the tornado, rain still fell in narrow bands, and the town finally had to bury its dead in ground turned heavy as clay brick. Nora Bell was laid near the school rise with 2 surviving pupils, placing wild sunflower heads on her coffin lid. Mateo Quinn was buried in his work coat, his rope gloves folded over his chest, while the 3 horses he had tied safe at the trough were led past in silence. Infant Clara Boone was carried by her mother and father between them, wrapped in a quilt Nora had once mended during winter term. No one called the storm a squall again. By September 19th, when the clouds broke enough for full daylight, the first reckoning began without ceremony. It came as private approaches to Roy's work table, one by one, while he sharpened tools or checked water casks. A seamstress who had refused the shelter threshold in hail brought 2 repaired blankets and said she had told her daughters that decent families did not go into earth, and that decent families had lived because they did. A grain broker returned the exact phrase he had used in mockery, Badger Dean, then placed $20 in silver on Roy's plank and asked whether floor vents could be built beneath a warehouse. The councilman who had argued against public refuge stood hat in both hands and admitted that confidence had been his only building method. Roy accepted blankets, accepted coin for communal supplies, and answered each question with dimensions, material lists, and labor hours. Silas Pemberton waited longer, not from pride now, but from the weight of being heard when he spoke. On the 22nd of September, the town gathered in the churchyard, where one wall remained standing, and benches had been set from salvaged pew planks. Prairie Rose counted 289 souls present, with the absent named and the injured resting under canvas to the east. Silas stood in mud-stiff broadcloth that no longer fit his frame cleanly, his watch chain gone, one sleeve patched from hotel linen. He did not ask for the platform. He stepped forward from ground level and spoke in a voice that carried because it did not posture. I called this man paranoid. I called him dangerous to commerce. I named his work Harmon Folly and repeated that phrase until children used it as play. I built high to be seen. He built thick to endure. My hotel failed in less than 1 minute. His walls held 94 souls through direct strike. I don't ask you to forget what I said, and I don't ask him to pardon me quickly. I ask for instruction, and I offer my crews, my accounts, and every contract I still possess to rebuild this town by methods that kept us alive. The silence after that statement was long enough for wind to move through broken rafters and for everyone to hear it. Then others rose. The mercantile clerk confessed he had denied Roy nails on instruction and had laughed while writing cash totals. The school board chair admitted he had approved a bell tower without lateral bracing because it looked prosperous from the railroad. 2 carpenters said they had declined Roy's wages from fear of losing favor, and one repeated his own summer line, "No one needs a storm cave in civilized country," before lowering his head and asking to apprentice under the very man he had mocked. Shame in Prairie Rose did not come as spectacle. It came as exact quotation. Roy listened standing beside the table where burial records and ration figures lay open in the same ledger. When the last speaker finished, several in the crowd asked him to answer at once, and a few called for formal forgiveness so business could move forward cleanly. He did not give them that release. He placed his palm on the ledger page where the 3 deaths were written and spoke with the same measured cadence he used for tool instructions. 3 names are in this book who will not return: Nora Bell, Mateo Quinn, Clara Boone. Grief is not a gate that opens because a crowd asks it. I did not build those walls for revenge, and I will not use this day to settle debts. If Prairie Rose wants change, then change must be measured in winters survived, in anchors set before spring storms, in stores kept full when weather is fair, and indoors marked for all souls without asking payment first. I will teach any hand ready to work by rule and repetition. Whether that becomes forgiveness is for time and conduct to decide. No one applauded. They began assignments. Before the week ended, Silas transferred his intact lumber inventory to a public rebuild ledger overseen by Roy Elias Boone and 2 councilwomen appointed by open vote. By October, first crews were retrofitting the depot office with buried sill ties and corner straps sunk to deadman anchors. The mercantile, rebuilt at reduced height, gained an earth-backed rear room with 2 offset entries and a vent baffle copied from Roy's design. The school site was moved 30 yards east to firmer ground, and the new bell frame was built low, cross-braced and tied into masonry piers. Children still rang it, but now the town had no appetite for ornamental risk. In November, when the first hard freeze arrived at 18 degrees, Roy sent copies of his storm ledger, damage map, and construction notes to the county seat by freight packet, along with sworn statements from Silas and the school board on failure points in unstrapped frame construction. The county clerk acknowledged receipt in December and entered the packet into territorial agricultural proceedings. 2 surveyors visited in March 1892 to inspect the Harmon Refuge and left with measured drawings of wallpaper, door offset, and vent turns. Physical evidence that began as one widower's precaution entered public record and traveled farther than gossip ever had. Years altered Prairie Rose in visible increments. By the second week of September 1893, every new permit inside town limits required 1 reinforced earth room or below-grade cellar with dual egress. In 1896, the church was rebuilt in limestone and sod backing. with a plaque naming Nora Bell, Mateo Quinn, and Clara Boone, not as symbols of ruin, but as the cost of learning late. In 1899, Silas sold the remaining interest in speculative lots and took charge of retrofit crews under Roy's specifications across 3 neighboring settlements, where he introduced himself not as master builder, but as a man corrected by wind. The phrase "built Harmon thick" entered local speech first as technical shorthand, then as praise. By 1903, Prairie Rose counted 427 souls, and each household kept a storm barrel list posted near the hearth by ordinance and habit alike. Roy never held office. He kept freight work part-time, taught construction evenings without fee, and required every student to train 2 others before claiming competence. When drought years came, those same storage routines helped ration water and grain without panic. Preparation proved transferable. Decades pass, rail maps change, storefront names fade and are painted again. Children who survived the 1891 strike become grandparents who point to earth-banked walls and explain why doors are offset and anchors buried deep. The original refuge still stands on the southwest parcel, grass grown over its broad shoulders, outer wall scarred where timber struck, interior benches worn smooth by use. The board beside the gate is replaced twice, but the words remain the same. Storm shelter, enter without asking. Travelers who stop at Prairie Rose in late summer still walk out to those 8-foot walls. They place a hand on packed sod and feel, even in heat, the steady cool held inside. They read the county marker set there in 1924, paid jointly by town subscription and Silas Pemberton's final bequest, and they learned that wisdom on the frontier was not always inherited from elders or printed in manuals. Sometimes it was learned under wreckage, paid for in grief and proven by labor, repeated until mockery ran out of arguments. In that way, Roy Harmon's legacy endured not as a monument to fear, but as a civic discipline. Measure honestly, build for the worst day, and keep the door open when it comes. The afternoon those travelers stood with palms against the packed sod, Roy Harmon was near the gate mending the 3rd board sign, drawing each letter in lamp black with a brush made from horsehair and twine. His beard had gone nearly white, but his hands still moved with the same freight yard economy that had once counted pennies and rope knots. Lena Boone, now gray at the temples and steady as her father had been, guided the visitors through the offset door and pointed out what still remained from the day of ruin. The vent crank with its worn wooden handle, the chalk grooves cut into the floor where rows had formed, and the ledger shelf scarred by boots and rainwater. She lifted a wrapped bundle from a dry niche and unfolded oilcloth to reveal the original storm ledger. The page for September 14th, 1891 remained legible. 94 souls entered before impact, then additions by lantern after the strike. 3 names were written lower on the page in darker pencil because Roy had pressed harder that night than at any other time in his life. No one in the chamber spoke while those names were read. A wagon rattled up from Main Street before the visitors had climbed out again, and young Deputy Clerk Harlan Pike stepped down with a tin dispatch box under his arm. He had ridden from the county seat by relay team, coat still dusted white from the road chalk. "The certified copies are here," he said, handing the box to Roy. "The 1891 packet, the 1892 survey drawings, and the retrofit ordinances through 1908. The clerk asked that they be placed in town custody before sundown." Roy opened the box on the bench platform and checked each document by title and seal. The sworn statements from Silas Pemberton and the school board were there, along with the measured cross-section of wallpaper and the failure map of Old Main Street. He nodded once, then passed the papers to Lena. "Second shelf, dry wrap," he said. "Public record stays where any hand can read it." By the last Thursday of May 1924, heat returned sharp and early, and the old warning pattern assembled itself over Prairie Rose with disquieting precision. Swallows dropped low over the ditch lines at noon. Cattle drifted tight to lee fences, though pasture stood open. The west horizon darkened not with rain curtains, but with layered cloud and a clear slot beneath. No one called it superstition now. The bell at the rebuilt school struck 3 deliberate warning peals, and every household began the drill posted by ordnance beside its hearth. Roy did not ride out any more, but his system rode for him. Rope lines were uncoiled from church hooks and stretched to anchor posts set in stone. Water casks were rolled to entry points and marked by quart chalk. The mercantile, rebuilt low after the disaster, opened its rear earth room at once, with Clara Boone's younger brother reading names at the threshold, because his mother had insisted that memory be work, not ornament. Elias Boone's old forge trough, still set where Mateo Quinn had tied those horses, held the first line of reins as teams were brought in and calmed. When the first hailstones struck, travelers from the South Road were already under cover at the Harmon Refuge, and Lena was assigning bench rows by the same floor marks, drawn 3 decades earlier. Roy stood by the inner door and watched the count rise. A woman from the wagon party, hearing the old nickname from no one and seeing only practiced order, asked if this was the famous Folly. Roy answered without bitterness. It was called that once. Now it is a room with good walls. Sit your children on the second tier. The storm crossed 2 miles north of town and clipped the far pasture, tearing a windmill and 1 hayshed, but sparing the main street entirely. By dusk, the cloud line had moved east into violet light. Prairie Rose had no funeral to hold, no collapsed roofs to clear, and no uncounted children to search for among splinters. The contrast was visible enough to silence even those born long after 1891. That evening, with the air washed clean and cool at 61 degrees, the town gathered in the churchyard for the marker dedication that had been scheduled before the warning peals. The stone stood on a timber cradle draped in plain canvas, paid by public subscription and the final bequest of Silas Pemberton, dead these 2 years and buried on the hill above his former hotel lot. Harlan Pike read the bequest letter aloud by lantern light because Silas had asked that no sentence be softened. I delayed my admission until weather removed the shelter of pride. At the threshold in 1891, I looked back at my own building failing and intended to say, Roy, I was wrong. I did not speak. I stepped inside and let him work. This marker is not payment because no payment equals 94 lives held. It is record. Let no builder in this town ever mistake appearance for strength again. The old laborer who had measured Roy's doorway in secret stood next, hat turning in his hands. He gave his name clearly, Amos Tilley, and confessed what many had guessed for years. I paced that door for Silas the night he mocked it. I brought him the number. I said nothing to Roy because I like my wage better than my courage. That measure stayed in my pocket while children sang Harmon Folly in the road. I have carried that shame long enough. I speak it now where all can hear. Others followed, not with theatrical weeping but with exact memory. The clerk who had denied nails on credit, the seamstress who had refused the threshold for 1 fatal minute, the broker who had called Earth Shelter an animal den. Each quoted their own words and set them down like tools returned after misuse. When the last confession ended, several souls turned toward Roy expecting absolution shaped as ceremony. He rose slowly from the bench, leaning on the ash cane Elias had made before his death, and rested that cane against the marker stone. You have spoken plain, he said. Plain speech is useful. It is not sufficient. Nora Bell is still dead. Mateo Quinn is still dead. Clara Boone is still dead. The wind does not bargain with regret, and neither does earthwork. If you ask what I offer tonight, I offer the same thing I offered in Rain and Wreckage: instruction, ledger discipline, and open doors. Forgiveness is not a receipt stamped once and filed away. It is what your hands prove each season before stormlight. No applause followed. The town accepted the terms because they had lived long enough to know their weight. Canvas was pulled from the marker. The inscription, cut deep, read, "Build for the worst day. Enter without asking. Teach the next hand." After the crowd thinned, Lena and Harlan carried the dispatch box documents into the refuge and shelved them beside the original ledger, each wrapped in oilcloth and labeled by year. Roy checked the latch, tested the vent crank one turn, and set his pencil beside the entry page where the next count would begin whenever needed. He did not lock the door. Roy Harmon died in January 1929, during a week of dry cold, 82 years old, in the small side room he had finally allowed himself after training 2 generations to run the shelter without him. Prairie Rose buried him at noon under clear sky, then resumed by his written instruction, the winter inspection of anchor straps and cistern seals before dark. No business closed for spectacle. Work continued as tribute. The refugee still stands, broad-shouldered under grass and weather, with rope hooks maintained, barrels rotated and names updated each spring by schoolchildren who learn both arithmetic and duty at the ledger shelf. Houses across Prairie Rose remain built, Harmon thick where it matters most, and the town keeps copies of every storm report in public reach, from the 1891 packet to the latest county survey, because evidence forgotten is risk invited. Travelers still place a hand on the wall and feel the cool held inside. They read the stone and understand that the lesson was never paranoia, never pride, and never revenge. It was preparation made generous, measured in lives kept.